Okay, part 2, here we go. So to summarise what would happen with those tests, if literate, if you could read or write, then you would do the alpha test. If you failed the alpha test, then you would go to the beta test. Or, if you were illiterate, then you would do the beta test. So if you failed it, beta test for you, beta test for you. So that's pictorial, that's using the picture one. If you still failed both, and remember they're actually taking an ordinal measure of your IQ, so 32 or 100, but they must have had a cut-off point that meant below, 10 or 20, I don't know what, then we're classing that as failed. If you failed both, individual spoken test, but as we were saying, very few people actually got that when they should have done. Okay, so moving on. The key findings, they're facts. Okay, now that's purposefully put down there. These aren't facts at all, but they are facts that Yerkes argued. Previous research set the standard for adult mental age at 16 years. Okay, so we knew what the mental age should be at 16 years. Yerkes had found that the average mental age for a white American adult male was just above the edge of moronity at 13. So that was why Gould called his study a nation of morons, because the majority of the males were just above the edge of moronity. So a nation of morons. And as such was taken by the eugenicists. A eugenicist is somebody who believes in innate ability, genetic ability, to show that the poor, Negroes, and feeble-minded had been interbreeding and lowering the overall intelligence of the population. Okay, so they're saying, what's your explanation for everyone coming out as morons? Well, they said, if you look at the findings, then the poorest and the black recruits are the lowest, so they're dragging the average down, and they are breeding and creating people of little intelligence. Okay, which, if you are a eugenicist, then you're quite happy with that explanation. Because it makes you feel good, because you're not one of them. However, if you're not a eugenicist, then you see that for the argument that it is absolutely ridiculous. It was possible to grade European immigrants by their country of origin. Okay, so you could say, what country are you from? And then you could say, right, you're probably going to be an average IQ of 13 or whatever it was. So the average man of many countries was a moron, but the fair people of Northern and Western Europe scored higher than the Slavs of Eastern Europe and the darker people of Southern Europe. The average Russian had a mental age of 11.34, the Italian 11, and the Polish 10.74. The black men had an average mental age of 10.41. However, the lighter the skin colour, the higher the score. So there you go. You can grade people according to the colour of their skin. You will have a higher score the whiter you are, according to Yerkes' facts. Sometimes when you see, this is a little lesson to learn, sometimes when you see someone presenting evidence to you and it doesn't fit with your values, then you should always look to challenge it. And that obviously doesn't fit with what is common sense. Why should the colour of your skin determine your IQ? Okay, and so, if it doesn't ring true with your values, then look further at it. What's wrong with the measures? And that's what Gould is doing. So, what was the subsequent developments of this? What was the impact? Well, first of all, a huge impact on officer screening. By the end of the war, 2/3 of men had been promoted who had taken the test and achieved good results. Okay, so they had been labelled as being worthy of promotion into officer positions. According to Yerkes, there was also a steady stream of requests from commercial concerns. So educational establishment, individuals such as businesses for the use of army methods, psychological examining, or for the adaptation of such methods for special needs. Now, there's a lot of money in psychometric testing, and I used to go on holiday to and hire a chateau in France that was a big castle type thing. It was quite cheap to rent, but if you owned it, the guy who owned it was actually a psychometric tester. And so there is still money in psychometric testing. Businesses like it if you can nicely give your recruits or your employees a psychometric test and it says this person is worthy of greater things, then that's quite useful to you. In education, if you can imagine, if you are streaming people based on psychometric tests, then these tests, if you were a black student, you were obviously going to be screened for much lower ability classes or not even allowed into the educational system than the white student, and we'll look at why that was in a second. So they were very popular, a steady stream of requests. This meant that mental testing in psychology had achieved the credibility of a hard science that Yerkes wanted. People lapped it up. People loved it. Specifically, white people loved it. Racist people loved it because it scientifically supported their racist, prejudicial beliefs. The fact that the average mental age of an American was 13 was concerning, but most important implications of these tests was the differences in racial and national groups. So bearing in mind that these tests were now an accepted measure of innate intelligence, here was evidence that there really was a difference between the racial and national groups. Interestingly enough, Nordic people from Northern Europe had been shown to be the most intelligent. Now, the Nordic people from Northern Europe who had emigrated were generally the people in power in America. Okay, so if you originated from Britain, if you originated from Northern Europe, then you tended to be the people in power in America, and the people like Yerkes who are writing the tests. The 1924 Immigration Restriction Act was the most shocking development from this study. Now, if you imagine in today's world, Donald Trump saying we want to ban immigration from particular countries or whatever it is, then this seemed a million miles away a few years ago when I taught this, but now it doesn't seem a million miles away. If Trump had evidence that there was scientific credibility to people from particular countries being banned from entering America, he would have loved that scientific evidence. He wouldn't have been critical of it. The 1924 Immigration Restriction Act, people from Southern and Eastern Europe and from Alpine and Mediterranean nations who had scored very poorly were no longer welcome in the USA. This is 1924. Historians amongst you will already be thinking this is going to be bad for them. It was decided that the quota of immigrants allowed to America, so they decided this really small quota. In the past, America had a completely open door policy. You could just go to America. It was what America was founded on. There was no one there other than the Native Americans, the indigenous tribes. So America was completely built on an open immigration policy. So 2% now of each recorded nation was taken from the 1890 figures. So they said, we'll look back at 1890's figures and we'll allow 2% of each of these countries in. This obviously meant that the number of unwanted would be very low. So they kind of hid the fact that they were being discriminatory by saying 2% of everybody. But what they knew was, in 1890, the number of people from these particular countries that scored poorly was much lower than the 1920 proportion of immigrants. There was a census in 1920, but they didn't use that to take the 2% from, because there would have been lower amounts of the European immigrants, of Eastern European immigrants, in the 1891. So because they took the 1891, they could now justify taking even lower Eastern European immigrants. Now, Eastern Europe, if you think of Poland, and you think of Estonia, and you think of Ukraine, you think of out that way, those are specifically the countries that are about to be invaded by Hitler. These immigration restrictions were to have horrendous consequences, as the immigration from Southern and Eastern Europe all but ceased. The persecution of Jews, which started well before the actual beginning of the Second World War, meant that many Jews tried to escape their homeland, and because there was a no-admittance policy to America, a lot didn't get in. Calculations suggest that as many as 6 million people from southern and central Europe were denied entry to America between 1924 and 1939. Now, after 1939, when the Second World War starts, it's very difficult to get out of Germany. It's very difficult to get out of Poland after it's invaded. So an awful lot of people who may have ended up in a concentration camp were denied entry because of this guy arguing psychology is science. The fate of many of them as a result of the Nazi regime is well known. Each recruit was graded. So in other developments, so back to just the immediate aftermath, each recruit was graded from A+ to E-, and suggestions made as whether they were suitable placements in the army. So grade C indicated low average intelligence, so you should just be an ordinary private. And even if you had done some heroic things, you were not going to be made into or if you had great leadership skills, you weren't going to be made into an officer because you had been graded C. Men scoring below grade C were thought not to be suitable officer material, and as they were unsuitable for tasks requiring special skill, forethought, resourcefulness, and sustained alertness. So they really were labelled as not appropriate. So what were Yerkes' conclusions? There's a big difference between Yerkes' conclusions and Gould. For Yerkes, nations can be graded by their intelligence. America is a nation of morons. By Gould, however, IQ tests are culturally and historically biased. IQ tests do not measure innate intelligence. IQ testing is often unreliable. IQ tests may not produce valid results, so are they measuring what they intend to measure, IQ, intelligence, then often not, and inappropriate, poorly administered IQ tests can lead to tragic consequences. So that's the social control element. Now, we're going to have a look at how he justifies this by looking at the 3 army tests. These are the overall conclusions of Gould that we'll come back to this slide at the very end. But let's look at what Gould's criticisms were. So first of all, the Army Alpha test. Let's see the problem. Although the tests were considered by Yerkes to measure native intellectual ability, so not impacted by education or culture, that's his claim, they were in fact extremely culturally biased. Those unfamiliar with American culture could not achieve a decent score. Okay, apologies for the question mark, that's not necessary. The following examples give some idea of the type of questions asked. So, see how you would do. Crisco is a patent medicine, disinfectant toothpaste, or food product. Washington is to Adams as first is to. Christy Matheson is famous as a writer, baseball player, or comedian. Now, if you're thinking, I have no idea about any of those 3, some of you might have an idea about this one, but if you think I have no idea about any of those 3, that is also how you would feel if you weren't familiar with particular products, perhaps because you were poor in America, if you hadn't been educated in history, and if you didn't read or weren't up to date with cultural events. So if you didn't read regularly, so again, the poorest in America at this time did not get free education. You weren't being educated as a black person in a slum in New York City. So you would have no idea about any of these 3. The answers: Crisco is a toothpaste, a frying thing. You fry food with it. Food product. There you go. Food products there as well. So it is a food product. This was the Christy Matheson baseball. And the first presidents. It was Washington is to Adams as first is to second was the answer. You had to know the order of the American presidents. So again, if you're living in a slum in New York, or if you've just come out of slavery less than 100 years earlier, and your family are still suffering those effects of not being employed or whatever it is, you're not going to be familiar with these products. This is very early on. video 3 we shall finish this off, and we'll have a look at the criticisms of the Army beta test next.